Matt Schaff and Jared Small of DraftSharks.com here, and Jared just published the Fantasy Football Draft Guide on DraftSharks.com. We're going to be building off of that to answer some of the most common draft questions here today. And Jared, we're going to start it at what position should I pick first in a fantasy draft? Now, this ties into the main purpose of that draft guide, which is what people who have been with Draft Sharks would commonly know as our perfect draft series, where we run through an entire draft, show you the best way to navigate each round from each different set of draft positions. And we do it across formats. We put out one early this year, so it's just 12-team PPR so far. More will be coming. So if that's not your format, then don't worry. We're going to hit your format later on. Now, focusing on that, what position should I pick first? Position, of course, means like running back, wide receiver. Who should I target at the beginning of my draft? Jared, I was reading over your article, and we've got 4 buckets of draft positions split up into each like 3 pick area: 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9, 10 through 12. The predominant round 1 pick is wide receiver. Not everybody, it's not every position you take a wide receiver, but most of the buckets that we're looking at have more wide receivers listed than running backs. So is it fair to say probably a wide receiver is how you want to start?
Yeah, the actual answer to what position should I pick first is it depends. And people are going to hate that answer, but it really does depend on your scoring system and your starting requirements predominantly, how many players you need to start at each position, because those things impact player values a lot more than you'd think. But generally speaking, I do like leaning towards taking a wide receiver with your first round pick this year. Part of it is just liking the safety and upside those wide receivers bring. And we're talking Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, then even getting to, Stephon Diggs and CeeDee Lamb, I think are excellent first round picks. So it's partly that. It's partly because you're really more so this year than any year I can remember, at least in the last handful of years, you can find really safe bets for volume at running back in rounds like 4 through 6. And, that shouldn't totally impact what you do in the early rounds, but it should have some bearing, right? Because these aren't just singular picks in a vacuum. You're building a fantasy football team. So what you can get in the later rounds should impact your strategy in the early rounds, at least a little bit.
And that's why practicing with stuff like the mock draft trainer on DraftSharks.com helps, because you can run through it and try different combinations and see what you like best in the end. This ties into question number 2 for our video here, and that is, what positions should you draft in order? So, Jared, obviously that begins with what you take in round 1, but it quickly turns into what's available to you in round 2, what makes the most sense there, what are you looking at in the next few rounds? Like you said with the first one, it depends. That's always going to be the answer. And anybody who doesn't tell you that is lying to you for the sake of a hot take. My biggest key here is flexibility, that first pillar of redraft play on DraftSharks.com, which is pursue value above all else. And people can find our strategy on DraftSharks.com now in the DSU section. Pursue value above all else. That means I don't want to tell you that you're going to take this in round 1, you're going to take this in round 2, and you're going to take this in round 3, because if I say you should be taking a running back in round 2, but your entire league passes on Davante Adams and he's there at the end of round 2, then you should take Davante Adams. And the same goes on with other specific players throughout. So you want to be flexible. That's part of this strategy. If you start out with knowing what's good to target at the different spots, then you know what's value when it gets to you, right?
For sure. And that's where the customized cheat sheet on your draft forum is so huge, because that's dynamic. That's adjusting throughout your draft based on your team needs, based on what's still available, based on your scoring system, based on the starting requirements. Like the Fantasy Football Guide Perfect Draft, definitely read it. But that's a basic game plan heading into your draft. These drafts, we know they never go according to plan. They don't go straight down the ADP sheet. You're going to find values that you didn't expect. So be flexible, take value where it presents itself early. In the later rounds, you can start to worry about, filling out different starting spots in your lineup.
And that's why the perfect draft article is never an article that says, take this guy in round 1, take this guy in round 2, take this guy in round 3. We always give you several options, and normally several at each position, because what you want to do is know what you should be targeting, the pool that you're looking at, the tiers that you should be looking at, as opposed to a specific player that you need to be watching for or that you have to take. Now, because, Jared, we know that everybody's going to be annoyed if you just leave it as it depends, Let's get a little bit more specific because I know I've most commonly and most comfortably been starting my drafts with wide receiver in round one, with a running back in round two. Certainly not all the time, but the difference in round two versus other recent seasons is that we're getting high quality running backs in that round,
Yep.
guys that could lead the position in scoring by the end of the year. We've got Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, Nick Chubb, Tony Pollard, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, guys spread throughout the round. So it certainly depends some on where you're picking and obviously who gets to you, but there are running backs that can fit in every area of round two. And they also
Yep.
go with wide receivers that I don't think look all that different from the wideouts that we see in round three.
Yeah, for sure. And even some of those running backs, you'll see them drop into round three at times. Derrick Henry, Josh Jacob with the whole holdout concerns. Now, Ramondre Stevenson is a guy I like in round three. So yeah, my running back strategy is sort of driving my overall draft strategy. And next, what I mean by that is I'm with you. I like taking those second, third round running backs. And then there's another pocket of running backs in rounds 4 through 6. J.K. Dobbins, Miles Sanders, Cam Akers, James Conner, Alexander Madison is another one in there. Guys where I think we can, reasonably count on 15 to 20 touches per game from that. If you, have that as your RB2 that you can get in round 5 or 6. I like, fishing from that pool for my second running back. And then everything kind of falls into place around, those first 2 running back picks for me.
This is also something that's going to differ from best ball to lineup setting leagues if you play both of those formats. Like for best ball, it makes sense to take a running back in round 2 and then just kind of forget about the position for a few rounds and then look at it again. But as we get into lineup setting, the thing that made rounds 3 through 5 or whatever the exact range, the running back dead zone in recent seasons is we got guys with big time questions. But right now, what we're seeing is some running backs get pushed down that as long as they're healthy and not holding out, they're great bets for weekly touches. Ramondre Stevenson, you mentioned, Josh Jacobs' name we talked about. If those guys get into round 3, those guys, as long as they're healthy, are going to be dominating the backfield work for their team. So that's a strong round 3 pick. You can take a wide receiver early in round 1. You can take 2 running backs in round 2 and round 3, and then just collect wide receivers over the next few rounds. And you've got these 2 running backs that you'll probably feel comfortable putting into your lineup basically every week.
Yeah, and I think that works well because I think, as you kind of alluded to, wide receiver does feel kind of flat once you get outside, like, I don't know, maybe midway through round 3. I think there's some, high upside wide receivers going, late round 2, early round 3. But beyond that, these guys going in round 4 and round 6, and anywhere in between kind of feel not the same, but similar enough.
And again, a key is to be flexible between wide receiver and running back in those rounds like 4 through 8, because that's where you really find those guys that have the path to, a breakout or a season defining type year, but they just have like one question that you can't answer that could get in the way and could make them nothing special or could get out of the way and make them something special. So it's great if you can collect a bunch of them, not necessarily have to count on that guy to be in your lineup, but maybe get that one player that propels you like Josh Jacobs was last year for his fantasy teams. How many of each position should I draft is a related question. And I think, Jared, one very common mistake is in a single 10 to 12 team league, a team drafting 2 quarterbacks or 2 tight ends, really no matter what else they're doing. I think almost always for me in those leagues, I'm stopping at 1 quarterback unless I waited a while and I'm specifically taking 2 platoon types or taking a second tight end. I want to just almost always take 1 tight end unless I'm waiting until the end and taking 2 and then seeing which one of them turns into something. But even in that case, I'm okay taking Hayden Hurst at the end. And if he doesn't work out, then I'll drop him for somebody else. So I think that's one key point, is to just take 1 at those 2 positions. And then that opens up what you can do otherwise.
For sure. And again, it does depend on, as you said, I think roster size, how many bench spots are in your league, just how deep your waiver pool is. If your rosters are huge and the waiver pool is kind of thin, then, it might make more sense to take a second tight end or a second quarterback. But yeah, generally I think 1 is good, especially if you're getting, one of the top, 10 guys at each position. Between running backs and wideouts, I would much rather spend bench spots on running backs who are 1 injury away from having a big workload, right? It's always easier in season to find usable wide receiver weeks. So use those, last few picks, those last few bench spots on those running back stashes that, they're not going to help you at all if the guy in front of them stays healthy. But again, just 1 injury, those running backs can become, weekly starters and even, like top 20 running backs just based on volume.
Yeah, I want to have probably 6+ guys at both running back and wide receiver heading into the season, but I don't really care exactly how that's balanced between those two positions for my lineup setting team. In most cases, it certainly depends on how many flex spots, exactly what the scoring format is, and how many you have to start at each spot. Who should I draft in fantasy football, Jared? And I forgot to change the questions at the bottom of the screen for people who are watching, so sorry about that. But the question here, who should I draft? Fantasy football 2023. This is like the question where people say, who's going to be on all of your teams this year? And you always see big names thrown at that. And that's a mistake because earlier in the draft, the value changes more by specific draft slot than it does later. So if you're taking the same guy every time in like round 3, then you're missing out on some valuable guys if you're drafting multiple teams. Whereas the further you get, the more you can say, I'm taking this guy every time. You can take the same guy in every round 12 if you want to, and you're not losing a whole lot, right?
For sure. And again, this is a loaded question that we could spend an hour-long podcast talking about. Let's talk about quarterbacks for a second. I feel like we haven't talked quarterback much. And I think quarterback's interesting this year because there's guys at every range of the draft that I like, right? So like I'm not desperate to get any one of them. I'll kind of let the draft kind of play out. Justin Herbert is my favorite pick in the earlier rounds. He's a guy who I think, has a good chance to finish top 5 this season, could even, sneak into the top 3. Deshaun Watson is a guy I really like in the middle rounds. He's in maybe like an 8th round pick in ADP right now. Deshaun Watson coming off a shaky return last year, but I think that wasn't a major surprise coming off the long layoff in a new offense. Watson was an elite real life and fantasy quarterback before, that suspension, and he has plenty of weapons in Cleveland. So I like him as a mid-round target. And then I think in the later rounds, Geno Smith, I think, is a great target with plenty of weapons. He added some weapons. Jackson Smith and Jigba, Zach Charbonnet arrive. Should be a pass-leaning offense again in Seattle. So I like Smith if you're looking for, more of a floor quarterback option later in drafts. And then Anthony Richardson, the rookie in Indianapolis, he still has a double-digit ADP by our data. And for the rushing upside alone, you want a cheap version of Justin Fields. Anthony Richardson could be that for you. And again, you can get him in the 10th or 11th round.
I agree with all of those players. And I think Anthony Richardson's a good guy to bring up because that could be a spot where you take 2 quarterbacks because we don't know yet if Anthony Richardson's going to be starting week 1. You can get a fill-in probably off of waivers to start that week 1 if we get closer and he's not starting, but you can also probably use a roster spot on that insurance heading into the season. And then if Richardson is a week 1 starter and you're ready to use him, you can drop that extra quarterback for something else. A couple of very late quarterbacks that start out well schedule-wise that you could stash on your team. Jared Goff has a really nice start to his schedule at Kansas City with the game that has the highest over-under of that week. So we should get some shootout type of conditions. He's home for Seattle the next week, home for Atlanta the week after that. Both of those teams were 21st or worse in defensive DVOA last year. The Lions should be at least pretty good on offense. So Jared Goff should be off to at least a decent start. Obviously, we'll see how much of their scoring comes on the ground, but if the offense is set for good weeks, then the quarterback should be set for at least decent weeks. Bryce Young is a higher risk one because we haven't seen him play in the NFL yet, but he starts at the Falcons, home for the Saints, at Seattle, home for the Vikings, at Detroit, then at Miami before the week 7 bye. 4 of those 6 defenses ranked 21st or lower in DVOA last year. Miami did not, but it did rank 25th in pass DVOA. So that's a stretch of games where if Bryce Young is ready to just, take off, he could score more fantasy points than we anticipate early in the season.
The Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson combo would worry me a bit just with 2 rookies, but I think the Goff Richardson combo is perfect. That's definitely a combo I'll be targeting in a bunch of my drafts after hearing that early season schedule for Goff.
Yeah, Bryce Young would be maybe even a better pairing with Jared Goff. So you're taking those guys as streaming types. And we could go through other positions, but I think really your best bet is going to be reading Jared's perfect draft fantasy football guide to see the players that you can be targeting at the various times and, who else is available if that guy that you want to target is not there. So you're ready for however that draft's going to go. If you like what you see here, please leave us a rating, a review. Please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast feed so that you just get notified every time new content hits. And of course, you can find everything we're doing and talking about anytime at draftsharks.com.